Thank you so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. And thanks to the organizers for putting this together. I think these types of small conversations with people like you in the audience is really important. So I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to you about this today. As Michael said, I'm going to talk about some of our work from the University of Arizona, where we're combining ultrasound or sound waves to assist with mindfulness training. And let's see, there we go. Oops, I'm not getting a change on the screen, but there you go. So I've become fascinated recently with people on the internet who buy small plots of land with a little pond on them. And they ask a basic question, which is, how can I bring this ecosystem to life? How do I make it healthy in the way that you see on the screen, where you have lots of dynamically interacting and interdependent creatures who are supporting the health of that system? And it's really cool. You can watch them do this over a several-year period, usually. And what they find is sort of an obvious insight, which is that as you introduce different elements, so for example, the blue heron, into the system, you tend to get a dynamic balancing of the way that energy flows through the system. There's actually a mathematics and ecological science that defines how this energy flows. So you've got the producers at the bottom that are turning light energy into food, and that food propagates through the system. But the point is that you start to get an equilibrium in the system that creates health for the system, that makes it robust and actually capable to change when there's something like a fire that goes through the grassland. So this concept of balance obviously is found all throughout nature and in our cultures and our religions as well. And you might have seen this recently. This is a paper that came out in Nature showing that even at the smallest scales that we can measure, you see this type of balance. So this is the moment, some researchers figured out how to image the moment when two photons are undergoing quantum entanglement. And that's what it looks like. It's pretty cool, right? So obviously this principle was understood for a very long time. And when you turn to the brain, you can think of that as an ecosystem that's going to follow those same principles. Energy, and in this case information, are also flowing through our brains and our nervous systems. And they're going to follow these principles of balance and equilibrium as well. So if you look at something like depression, for example, this is a PET scan of someone who's depressed relative to someone or a group of people who are non-depressed. And what's obvious is that those processes go out of balance, all the way from the chemical dynamics in the brain to the cognitive processes. You're going to have an imbalance with depression in certain networks that we'll talk about in a minute. And when you start balancing or bringing those systems back into homeostasis, you literally see more of a balancing like you see on the right. And so our group has been really interested in ways to train this balance. So what's the mental version of the yin-yang symbol that I showed you, but for the nervous system? One concept that comes out of the contemplative and meditation literature is something called equanimity. Literally translates as inner balance, but we sort of tried to define it in a way that we can study that in the lab. So my collaborator, Shenzhen Yang, defines it as non-interference with the natural flow of sensory experience or sensory information as it flows through the system. Now, that's a lot of words that probably don't mean a lot to you right now. So imagine you had an emotion, like a strong emotion, positive or negative. As you practice skills of equanimity, what that means is that you're not resisting them, so you're not interfering with the flow of that emotion to push it away, and you're also not grasping onto it. So if it's a positive emotion, for example, you're not trying to hold on to it and missing out on the next moment. You can develop the skill of equanimity to be right in the middle, which doesn't mean that you're always calm and passive and you're not fighting for things like climate change. It actually means that when you read the news about climate change, you're fully present and experiencing that emotion, but you're not getting tilted into a state where you're going to ruminate for 12 days, as I used to do when I would read the news about climate change. So this is a skill that can be developed with things like mindfulness training. And actually, I think sports training and all kinds of other trainings elevate equanimity. And what we know from the literature is that as you train something like mindfulness, equanimity will increase. And that might be one of the predictors of why we see so many health outcomes for some of these interventions. In the same way as when you have an ecological system and you increase the balance across the different parts. So we started asking about that interference part. So if you look at part of that definition, It's the non-interference. Well, what's doing the interference with the flow of information through the nervous system? Well, you are, and other parts of you are. So we started looking into the systems in the brain that might be doing some of that interference, and looking for what we're colloquially calling the sort of non-equanimity hubs in the brain. We'll come up with a better definition as we define this. But obviously, one that pops up is the default mode network. I love talking after Judd Brewer because he just sets this up perfectly. But this is one of the networks that if you are tending towards depression, anxiety, or other psychological disorders, you can start getting that imbalance in the system. So it's not to say that the default mode network is bad and we want to get rid of it, but if there's too much inner processing, it's literally going to suck up the energy from some of the other systems in the brain. You're not going to have a healthy ecosystem. So we know that from basically looking at the depression literature. You'll see too much default mode network activity. If you train with mindfulness interventions or do psychedelic interventions, for example, you actually see these systems temporarily tuning down, using less energy. And when you check in with the person, this is a great experience for them because they're getting some distance from some of that inner activation. And so we started getting interested in technologies that could safely and temporarily modulate these systems. So if it's actually true that the default mode network is interfering with equanimity, we downregulate it. Can we increase baseline levels of equanimity? First question. Second question, does that actually lead to some of the positive health outcomes that we're really interested in? So we started using something called transcranial focused ultrasound. This is a new and emerging field all over the world. There's lots of researchers interested in this. The basic idea is you're using a focused beam of energy to modulate nervous tissue, like neurons, for example. And you're using low energy, so we're not talking about melting the brain or damaging the brain. This is the same level of energy they use for imaging. And so we have a good safety profile on that. But in the brain, what you can do is focus that beam of energy to quite precise areas. Now, this is an idealized case. You got to get through the skull. I don't have time to tell you about all the science, but once you deal with the skull, you can actually focus that beam right down to places like the default mode network. And so for the first time, we've been able to go to parts in the brain non-invasively that you could only get to with either pharmaceuticals or deep brain surgery by implanting an electrode. So it's a very exciting technology. And we started asking what happens when we modulate something like the default mode network. Does the participant report more equanimity? Can we see that change in behavior? And ultimately, does that help us train people in things like mindfulness training? So we started targeting the default mode network right here. What you're seeing is the focused ultrasound transducer targeting the posterior cingulate, that part that Judd was talking about. And the basic question is, can we change the network connectivity? Think about the ecosystem. You've got an interconnectivity of all the parts. That's the same thing happening in the brain. And we want to know, by tuning this down a little bit, do we change the way the brain regions are communicating? And that's exactly what we found. In blue, it's less connection. So if you think about this like the blue heron's just sort of eating too much food in a certain sense. We've tuned that down, and now everyone else is sort of released from that inner stickiness. And of course, in the placebo condition, we didn't find much of a change. Now, we started trying to test the phenomenology. What's it actually like for these participants? Their minds should be less sticky. They should be a bit more balanced when they get triggered, for example. The problem is that studying equanimity is quite hard in the lab, so we're still developing methods to operationalize it. But when we give people scales like mindfulness scales, we tend to see an increase in state mindfulness. And when we break those scales apart and try to look at things that are related to equanimity, so for example, how decentered, how sort of like non-stuck the person is in their experience, we do see an increase in those types of states, at least. We also try to look at the phenomenology more broadly. And so what you're seeing here is as you move out in this radar plot, that's the person reporting more of that. So for example, you see more loss of ego, which very small amounts, more inner peace. Sense of time was actually distorted, actually because they were more present is what most people reported. And so when we started checking in with people and asking them after to report what was going on with you, these people are actually inside the MRI scanner, so it's a little bit of a weird environment. They started reporting things like, my mind is less sticky. I'm having thoughts, so we didn't make the thoughts go away, because you don't want to do that. You want them to have thoughts. But when the thoughts came, they just sort of went back in the background and they could pay attention to this weird MRI environment. And that was a very salient experience for some of our participants. Actually, some of them said, I didn't know that I could let go of my thoughts that way. And after we finished, we debriefed them, we explained what the study is about. And some people learn this is about mindfulness, and they say, okay, I want to go learn how to get some more of that. Then they go try mindfulness a few times and realize how hard it is to get back into that state. So we think we can elevate baseline levels of equanimity or openness in a very subtle way right now. The question now is what happens when you combine that with training? So we don't want this to just be a passive thing that people put on their head. It's not going to stick. You want to unstick their minds but get the equanimity to stick in their lives. And so you have to do some type of training on top of this. So the idea is that as we can increase the baseline levels of equanimity, can we help people train the other skills that we think are underlying mindfulness? For example, concentration, so attending, as well as sensory clarity, another focus skill that allows people to track their sensations in time. And the hypothesis would be that they would be able to learn those skills faster, and that would translate to health outcomes sooner in the trials. And so I think I'm going over time. This is the last slide. So what we're doing now is actually a project that essentially was born out of a previous BrainMind summit. We learned about a grant here in 2019 and got this grant to do a study based on some work that David Cresswell had done at Carnegie Mellon, doing 2 weeks of mindfulness training in novice people never trained. And we're doing 4 sessions of ultrasound during that training and asking, do we increase baseline levels of equanimity? And does that translate into learning the mindfulness skills that lead to the positive health outcomes? So we're tracking these people over time, up to 6 months, to see if it translates out. We're calling this the SIMA protocol, the Sonication Enhanced Mindful Awareness Protocol. And we're hoping that this 1-2-week protocol will then fold into much longer protocols over time. All right, just thanking all these folks on the screen. Thank you.